Good morning, Ohio gozaimasu. Thank you for having us here at Sophia University. We're very excited. And Ambassador Kitaoka and Rieko, thank you for all of the partnership and friendship and many exciting efforts ahead. I'm deeply pleased to be here for many, many reasons. We have a lot of things to talk about, so we're going to have an excellent discussion. I'm also very pleased, I have to tell you, to be at a Jesuit university. This is also special because we work very closely with Pope Francis and with the leaders in the Vatican on these issues. And as you know, Pope Francis was a Jesuit, and then he was appointed Archbishop. He had to leave the Jesuit order formally, but he continues with a lot of the great traditions. And he wrote an encyclical a couple of years ago that I hope some of you have read, called Laudato Si, Praised Be. And it's a wonderful document about the importance of gaining control over our worst impulses that are leading us to destroy the natural environment. It's both a scientific document and a moral document, so it's a very unusual message from the Pope, and it's a message for all religions. It's not only for followers of the Catholic faith, but it's a message that he says at the beginning is for global discussion. Pope Francis, interestingly, gave the opening speech the day that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, because Secretary General Ban Ki-moon knew that it was important that there be a moral commitment and a moral foundation to the new goals that were to be adopted. So Pope Francis spoke to the world leaders in his capacity not as a political figure, but in his capacity as a moral leader. And he set a very important foundation. And I was very happy in that same regard to hear just now of JICA's vision statement, because that's also a moral statement. And the idea that JICA should be forging bonds of trust around the world for mutual benefit, I think is extremely important. And it's a great mission with a great leader of JICA, and very, very important, I believe, for Japan and very important for the world that that mission take place. And I'm also, finally, before I turn to the Sustainable Development Goals, thank you for mentioning my great admiration for Japan's role in economic development. I first came here together with my wife, Sophia, in 1981. So that was 36 years ago. And I began to study the Japanese economic history. And then we lived in Japan for a year in 1985, 86. And one of the, of course, great triumphs of this country was the Meiji Restoration in 1868 and following. I consider it the most successful economic reform in world history because it put Japan on a path of very remarkable economic reform. And one of the most incredible features of the Meiji Restoration was a famous worldwide mission called the Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873. That was before we could get on the internet and just Google the information. You had to go around the world to collect the information. And the leader of the mission Iwakura was one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, and he led a team that visited the United States, the United Kingdom, and parts of Europe. And the idea was really smart, and that was to search for the best practices everywhere. How were the best industrial developments taking place? Who had the best central bank? Who had the leading universities? Who had the best organized army? Who had the best constitution? And in 3 years, tremendous amounts of information were systematically collected. And when the Iwakura mission returned to Japan, these ideas were very systematically and peacefully put into place so that Japan was able to make a remarkable transformation and to achieve industrialization, to protect Japan's sovereignty, and to protect Japan's culture also. And these were great contributions for Japan, but also great lessons for the world about how to make economic reform. And one way to make economic reform is to study the rest of the world and find the best practices, find the best examples, understand how they work, and then put them to good use. Very smart countries do that. They look around and they understand there are lots of things to learn. Not so smart countries think they're the best, so they don't have to learn from anyone else. And countries that fall into the bad habit of thinking they're the best end up in trouble. One of those countries in history, probably the biggest mistake in economic history ever, was China, which was so sure that it was the Middle Kingdom and knew everything and didn't need to know anything else about all the rest of the world, closed already well before Japan after the 1430s and stopped looking around the world. And it led a few hundred years later to being far behind the rest of the world in technology. And of course, China suffered very, very badly for 150 years after that. Japan also closed relatively, not completely, after 1600, but quickly opened and learned from the rest of the world in this remarkable experience of the Meiji Restoration after 1868. So I learned those things when we lived here, and I became a great admirer of Japan's way of development and how it taught other countries how to develop. Because if you look at the experience in East Asia, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and then after 1978 in the People's Republic of China, they're all following Japan's model. And till today, I get wonderful delegations, as I got last week, from a very high-level delegation from China. Many people came. They all opened the notebooks. They said, "Professor, tell us whatever you know." So I talked for 2 hours. Then they closed the notebooks. I don't know whether they liked or didn't like what I said, but they listened. And I think it's very smart. My own country doesn't listen to anybody anymore. So we don't go around the world taking notes. Even when I spend a lot of my time in the United States saying they're doing it better in Sweden, they're doing it better in Norway. Nobody wants to hear that. Because I come from a country that knows it's the best of everything. That means that sometime soon it will be very far behind other countries because we stopped watching. It became very arrogant. And when you become very arrogant, you end up in a lot of trouble. And this is really one of the main lessons of history. It happened here too also, because after a big success, Japan became arrogant also, that it could impose its success elsewhere. We all fall into the same trap it ends badly. So the most important lesson, I think, is learn from others and don't become arrogant, because there's always something to learn. There are always areas where you're falling behind others, where there are advantages to be had. And anyway, if there's one lesson of history, it's that cooperation is 1,000 times worth more than trying to dominate, because domination is very short-term, very costly, and very illusory, whereas cooperation can last for a very long time for mutual benefit. So that is really the main lesson of history in any event. And there are lessons of history. And that, I think, is the main lesson of history, is that it's never worth it to try to dominate, because it's only a transitory gain. But learning and cooperating with others is really essential. So I want to talk about an area that we need to learn from each other urgently, and that is sustainable development. It's a very important concept. It's a concept that the whole world has adopted, but I think it's a concept that needs to be translated into the context of every country's traditions, every country's moral framework, every country's political framework. What is it? Sustainable development means that we should have a holistic vision of our society's development that not only aims at economic progress, but also at social fairness and at environmental sustainability. So the idea of sustainable development is a holistic view. We don't have that, for example, in the United States. If you look at the keywords in the newspapers, like the debate over our tax policy right now, which is going on as I speak, all that people talk about in power is economic growth. That's all that counts. They think that getting richer is the only thing that matters. And the United States became very rich on that philosophy, no doubt. It became very militarily powerful, no doubt. But it's not a very happy country right now. And indeed, if you actually ask Americans, are you happy? The numbers that say yes keep going down over the last 40 years. In recent years, falling very rapidly. And I think that that's quite accurate, actually. People are very nervous. They're not very happy at all. We have a lot of violence in our society. We have a very sharp distrust. Every day there's a mass shooting also. So it's a very unusual country, because we can't even face that truth honestly. So many guns, so much violence, so much tension, so many people shooting at each other. And this is a rich country, so it's not out of poverty. It's a country filled with anxiety right now. If you had Donald Trump as president, you'd also be anxious, unfortunately. He makes everyone very nervous. And this is another problem. We don't like our leaders to make us nervous. We like our leaders to give us some sense of comfort and some sense of security and assurance, but we don't have that feeling at all right now. So what is missing in the United States has been, for 40 years, the gap between the rich and the poor has widened very considerably. And that has led to a lot of distrust. And people don't trust the government. They don't trust the Congress. And I'm in that group because I watch how they behave. They're not looking after the general interest, and no sense of social justice, no sense of fairness. Even the tax legislation, which I think is more and more likely to be adopted is a proposal that literally will take away money from poor people and give it to rich people. Very unusual that a democracy would pass such a law. But the democracy is very strange because in my country, the congressmen spend a lot of money to be reelected, and they get the money from very rich people. And the rich people tell them, cut our taxes. And so the average people don't have any say in our politics right now, even though it's a democratic country. It's governed by the rich people. The other problem is that the growth is not compatible with a safe, natural environment. And the reason, there are many reasons for that. The basic reason for our environmental problems is just the sheer number of people on the planet and the sheer scale of economic activity. Right now, if you add up all of the production around the world, what's called the gross world product, adding up the gross domestic product of every country, if you use a scale called purchasing power adjusted prices, the world output is now $127 trillion for 7.5 billion people. So the average output per person is $17,000 per year. Now, how is that much being produced? Of course, tremendous amount of large-scale industrial production everywhere. And the production depends on massive amounts of energy use. And in the world today, about 85% of all of the primary energy used in the world economy comes from the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And they are wonderful in terms of making a modern economy. Very important because before we knew how to use coal in a steam engine, or before we knew how to use oil in an internal combustion engine, or before we knew how to use natural gas in a gas turbine, the world was poor. So without the fossil fuels, we would not have a wealthy economy. We would not be prosperous. The lights would not be on. I would not have been able to fly here on a gas turbine jet plane. We would not have a modern economy. But, as you know, it was already discovered 140 years ago that when you burn the fossil fuel and the carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere, that has a tendency to warm the Earth, because the carbon dioxide traps the energy received from the sun and prevents it from being radiated into space, the so-called greenhouse effect. And in 1896, it was already understood by a great Swedish chemist named Arrhenius, who won one of the first Nobel Prizes, that because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was rising because of all the burning of coal in his time, that the planet would gradually warm. And he estimated that if the amount of carbon dioxide would double, that would raise the temperature by about 3 degrees Celsius. And that was a brilliant calculation by a great chemist, even before there were any computers or any computer models. And he was right. But he said that will take about 750 years. And he was wrong about that, because he was better as a chemist than as an economic forecaster. He didn't know that industrialization would spread around the whole world, and that China would become one of the rich countries of the world, that it would even grow 35 times between 1978 and now, and therefore that the amount of carbon dioxide in use would rise so rapidly that by the middle of this century or the end of this century, we may double the carbon dioxide. In other words, maybe 150 years or 200 years, not 750 years that Arrhenius projected. So we are on a path where the world temperature could rise 3 or 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. What is the problem with that? Well, we know now every year we're seeing environmental catastrophes as a result of this human-made climate change. Because the higher temperatures mean more storms, more droughts, more floods, rising sea levels, more spread of diseases like malaria or dengue fever or Zika virus or other diseases spread by mosquitoes or other insects, other pests, forest fires like the huge forest fires we had in California just a few weeks ago. So the warming is a great threat that already is having major consequences. And this is why we need to do something about the environment. But in my country, we have lots of rich people who own oil and gas reserves. And there's something about oil that makes you mean. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of American oil people are really mean because all they care about is their profits. And they're not thinking about the rest of the world. They're not even thinking about their children who live on the same planet. And we have two especially nasty people named Coke. You have to know their names because they're two of the nastiest Americans. K-O-C-H, not like Coca-Cola. Two brothers. They inherited from their father lots of oil refineries. And they now each have a net worth of $50 billion. That's too much for anybody in this world. There really should be a 100% limit on wealth above a certain level, because when you get so rich, not only do you go crazy with arrogance, but you become too powerful. And so even a country like the United States with the Constitution and the rule of law cannot resist arrogant, greedy people with so much wealth. What do? They pay for the politicians. They give the money around. They pay for the campaigns. You know what else they do? They buy whole departments of universities and say you should have free market departments that only give lectures about how wonderful the free market is without regulation. They bought the whole department of economics of George Mason University, for example. They set up what we call think tanks in the United States. These are unthink tanks because they're paid to tell lies, like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. And they give them money, and then they say, global warming isn't real, or global warming doesn't matter, or global warming, we can't allow that to violate my free market private property rights. And so $50 billion can spread a lot of damage. And the reason we're getting a tax law that will take money from poor people and give it to rich people is that the Koch brothers paid for the Republican Party leaders, and they're doing what they ask for. So this is why we don't have sustainable development, because we have economic development that is unfair and that is environmentally unsustainable. Now, this is the general truth about the whole world right now, which is that the world economy has achieved a lot of growth. But for a very long time, people were not very much aware of the environmental damages. And I should add that it's not only the damages from the warming, but also from how we grow food. Because, as you know, as we get richer, we eat more meat in the diets, for example. And when you eat beef, every kilo of beef requires 10 or 15 kilograms of soybeans or other feed grains. Where do those come from? Well, they come from Brazil to an important extent. Where in Brazil? From the Amazon, or the margins of the Amazon basin, the Cerrado, so-called, or the Atlantic rainforest. They all get chopped down to make more room for the feed grains. Or as we get rich, we like more shampoos, or we like other products that use palm oil. Palm oil is a wonderful product, and it's very profitable to grow in Indonesia or in Malaysia. So profitable that if the businesses had their way, they would cut down all of the rainforest of Sumatra and Java and Borneo and just grow palm oil. And they would actually make a lot of money doing that. But the money would not take into account that the orangutan would go extinct, and many other species would go extinct, and the biodiversity of the Indonesian archipelago would be completely destroyed forever, not just temporarily. It could never come back. And so all over the world, we are destroying biodiversity and nature. When Sonia and I visited a part of Borneo, the part in Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, we were told we were going to a nature reserve, a forest protected area. As we drove in for about 100 kilometers, there was one massive truck after another in the other direction with logs bigger than you can imagine, all chopped down. The entire day, nothing but logs going out. Where are they going? They're going to China to build a wonderful boom of beautiful tropical hardwood homes for a big, fast-growing population. But they're chopping down all the trees, and then they will grow palm oil. And so this is another part of the environmental degradation. So the conclusion from this is that a market economy will not by itself result in fairness, and it will not by itself protect nature. And it can be the fact that we end up maybe with a few very, very rich people like the Koch brothers, but lots of people being impoverished, even put into misery. Because look at what happened this summer, for example. We had 3 major hurricanes in the Western Hemisphere: Harvey, Irma, and Maria, 3 big hurricanes. They all went through the Caribbean. And 2 of them, one hit Houston and one hit Florida. And the damage from the 3 was about $360 billion. $360 billion from 3 quick storms. And then these evil people in my country said, so what? That's a coincidence. That doesn't matter. And if the people are politically powerful, like in Texas, well, they get some emergency bailout of money. But if they are a colony of the United States, like Puerto Rico, which became a colony in 1898, when the US went to war with Spain so that we could have our own empire, then nobody cares. They can't even turn the light on anymore. So there still is a large part of Puerto Rico that doesn't even have electricity back. roughly 8 weeks after the hurricane hit, because it's a colony. They don't even have representation in the Congress to have a vote. So it's like a colony. They don't have any political power at all, and therefore nobody cares in the mainland about what's happening. So this kind of weakness of poor people is evident in many parts of the world, where people are already pushed away from their homes or suffering from the environmental degradation. So this is what led the world in a very special moment to adopt these Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals. I used to give talks in the General Assembly to the UN ambassadors during the 3 years that they were negotiating these goals. I used to ask them, ambassadors, are you nervous about your country? Is there anyone here not nervous, really not nervous? And then you could see, or they would say, how much endangerment there is in their country, whether they're at the coast because of storms, whether they're dryland countries that don't get rain now, whether they're wet countries that are getting too much rain and massive flooding. Everybody's worried. And almost everybody except the super rich are worried about the distribution of income in the world, because the companies got very powerful. And it's interesting, you know, the United States is actually a weak government with very strong companies. It sounds strange, but our politics is so corrupt with so much money changing hands that the one that really is in power is the companies, not the politicians. The politicians barely know what they're doing, but once they get a job, they want to stay in the job. And so the companies tell them, we'll help you stay in your job. You just pass the legislation that we write for you. So it's interesting. China is sometimes said, well, the government's so strong, the companies don't have the freedom. But you know, if you go the other way and the government's so weak that the companies rule everything, you also don't have an economy that can work. We need a balance, that governments are strong enough to regulate the companies, but not so strong that they crush the companies. This is the art of the middle way, which, by the way, I'll just make one point. In the Western philosophical tradition, our greatest philosopher and our greatest political scientist in Western history was Aristotle. So it's fitting you have a Greek name for the university, because the High Greek period was the greatest period of learning, I think, in the Western world. And Aristotle said that politics needed to follow the middle way. And that means always he was looking for the moderation, the balance, a mixed economy, and individuals that had the virtues of the middle way also, not denying themselves material goods, but not being obsessed by wealth as well. I think it's important for Japan and for every other country. Aristotle will not be your basis of tradition, maybe Confucius, maybe other traditions, but finding that path that helps to find this balance, I think, is crucial within one's own cultural references. So for me, Aristotle said, politics is about the common good. Machiavelli, another political scientist who came 2,000 years later, said, no, not quite 2,000 years later, but 1,500 years later, said, no, politics is just about power. It's just the battle of power. That's what we have in the US right now, just the battle of power, and the rich are winning. But we need politics of the common good. So the Sustainable Development Goals are really about the politics of the common good. They say we need a balanced approach to the world economy and to every individual economy. And the balance means economic prosperity for sure, but fair economy. Fair to women as well as to men. That's SDG 5. Income inequality not so wide. That's SDG 10. Peaceful societies. That's SDG 16. Japan is very peaceful. The US is very violent. We should learn something. First, take away the automatic weapons from all the crazy people in my country. I don't know, that's a big proportion, it seems. But this is the first thing that one should do, but we don't learn, unfortunately. So this is the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals. How many of you have studied the SDGs so far? Pretty good. How many of you know them by heart? All 17. There will be a short quiz at the end of this hour. Now, please learn them. Get online and study them to see what they are, to see the explanations. I wrote a book called The Age of Sustainable Development, and also a TV series for free, a MOOC, as we call it, online course. But I would like you to learn what are these goals. And we'll talk in just a moment about how they can be achieved. Because what I've said is that they're very important. And I do want to end by saying that having goals, I believe, is vital for a healthy society. If we don't have goals as a society, maybe we just end up either with societies that are just confused or just striving for wealth and power, but without common purposes. And I believe the SDGs are about common purposes: to make the world safe, to make the world fair, to stop the damage to the natural environment. We're going to have a discussion, and I will say some words about how these goals can be achieved. This is very important. There are engineers in this room. This is an engineering task more than anything, by the way. I believe the engineers have the lead role to play, not the economists. The engineers should tell us, how do you mobilize solar energy? How do you mobilize wind energy? Is nuclear energy safe? How should it be used? And so forth. How to make electric vehicles that are high-quality vehicles. These are engineering challenges. And then public policy, like my field of economics, should understand what kind of policies should we adopt to help put this in place. But what we should not accept is the greed or the struggle for power as our ultimate objective. Because if we do, we're going to end up with a very, very dangerous world. Thank you again for having me here.